welcome to my newest Blender tutorial. I recently started working on some backdrops for a few scenes I'm developing with Alex. So we started experimenting with displacement maps in Substance Painter and Blender to quickly get them done using professionally made textures. I will texture a very simple geometric shape that can be procedurally used for creating walls and corners. I have created a simple cylinder in Blender that I then subdivided and turned into a reference for our column shape. This will help me to visualize a bit better what I want to achieve without using any kind of reference. We start by adding a plane and rotate it so it matches the height of our column reference. Holding the Control key while rotating helps to rotate in increments of 5 degrees. We scale the plane so it is as tall as the column pillar. I have added some edge loops to increase the subdivision count of our plane. We can select all the faces of our plane and right-click to subdivide them further. We can now add a curve cycle that will allow us to turn our plane into a cylindrical shape. This is very important as it will help with the modularity of our shapes. On our plane, we want to add the curve modifier and select the curve that we have created as the target object. Set the deform axis to Z. Scale our plane until you see no more overlap between the points where the two sides meet. If we scale both of the curve cycle and the plane at the same time, we ensure that the form is kept the way we want it. One thing that I like to do is to parent the curve cycle to the plane, and then they will always transform in unions. Create a new window in our viewport so we can easily configure our UV map. As you can see, the plane is already unwrapped and it has completely filled the space. This will give us quite good texture information. Also, make sure your plane is set to shade smooth. We now want to create the top and the bottom of our column. This can be achieved by adding another curved circle in the plane. We will try using the array modifier method and our plane to make it curve around the circle path. To make the plane properly rotate with the circle, you need to add more subdivisions to the mesh. But let's first bring our reference closer and we can model our shape accordingly. We want to add loops on our plane where you see the column having geometry expanding outwards. The highest part of our mesh needs to be extruded outwards. Use X-ray, shortcut Alt+Z, to better see what you are doing when aligning the mesh to the reference. Move the reference in a better position in order to deform our plane so it fits what we are looking for. Delete the side faces of your extrude and add a few loop cuts on your mesh for more subdivisions. Once you are done, activate all your modifiers and put the reference away. We can see that our mesh is upside down, but you can easily fix that by rotating both the curve cycle and the plane. You can see that our array is causing a lot of overlap on our mesh, which is not going to look very good when we texture and apply displacement. To properly see the extent of our problem, go and add a new material for our mesh. In the shader editor, we can add a checker texture and the texture coordinate with UV selected as our coordinate. The pattern isn't looking great. We will definitely have distortion within the texture and overlap. Scaling the mesh will help us with distortions, but we still have an overlapping texture where the mesh meets. I finally got the mesh and texture closer to what I wanted, but more on that later. Make sure you parent the circle to the plane, and as we did before. Once that is done, start aligning your column together based on your preferences. Set the origin of your meshes in the center of the world. If you have followed my tutorials so far, your 3D cursor should still be in the center of the world, so when you select Object and set Origin to 3D cursor, your origin should be in the center of the world. Add a mirror modifier to both of your meshes to duplicate them on the Z-axis. This is normally a good way of using symmetry to save on texture space. Export both your meshes together. Make sure to tick the option Selected Objects Only and export as FBX. Bring our mesh in Substance Painter. We will apply this stylized Inca texture that you can find on Substance Source for download. You can also get this texture from the description below, as I have added it to a link alongside the working file. Go to our shader property and activate Hide Displacement. We also can increase our subdivision levels of the mesh so that the deformation looks good. You can see we have a lot of jagged edges where the displacement occurs. We can fix jagged edges by adding a filter on our texture and selecting the blur option. Don't overdo it on the intensity, as the blur option will also decrease your hide information. We can copy and paste the same texture, but this time we remove the blur filter. Instead, add a sharp filter so that the texture looks closer to what we had originally. Copy both of these textures to the second texture set so that we have the same settings applied on both meshes. As you can see, the texture and geometry deformation doesn't look quite right. We can try to reduce the texture size to a value of 1 on both the textures so they properly align. The geometry isn't working in our favor and neither are the UV maps. We must correct this Blender. Trying to subdivide the mesh in Blender might give us the result we want and we can get proper displacement. Export the mesh again and we can use the Project Configuration tab in Substance Painter to refresh our mesh with the new geometry settings. The displacement quality has slightly increased, but because of the array modifier that we have used to create this, we get seam-related issues where the textures aren't seamlessly blending with themselves. Back in Blender, I decided to remove the array modifier entirely and instead scale the mesh and locked to the x-axis in order to make it fit our circle and only have one seam. Remember that if you scale your mesh in edit mode and you have the option correct face transformation, then your UV will not get stretched as you scale. With this new fix applied, we can now finally export the mesh and properly work on it. This mesh and textures will not have any ambient occlusion in them due to us not baking anything. One way to fix this is by exporting the displaced texture from Substance Painter and then use it to bake our information. We can now export our textures. Use the settings as seen on my Blender export settings if you want to get the right maps for Blender. Add all of our textures in the shader editor and set them up like I do for applying ambient occlusion, roughness, and metallic texture. We will also bring the height map that we can use for the displacement modifier. Once you have the height map added, you can add a subdivision modifier and increase the levels to around 4 or 5. Also bring a displace modifier where we can apply our height texture. Make sure the coordinate is set to UV map. As mentioned before, you can use the same plane that we used to create this cylinder in order to create walls and other such structures. Press Shift plus D to create a copy of your plane and deactivate the curve modifier. Our scene is starting to move quite slowly due to the number of polygons and activate modifiers. The poly count is not the issue here. It is the modifiers that are slowing everything down, so we need to keep an original mesh intact, but the duplicates must have their modifiers applied. Applying the modifiers will take a bit of time because the poly count is so high. We will decimate most of this geometry, and you can do this as many times as you need until you are happy with the result. One very quick way to apply all modifiers to your mesh is by selecting your mesh, going to Object and select Convert to Mesh. You might need to add a few decimate modifiers, but I would add and apply one at a time as you don't want your performance to suffer. I haven't kept any original mesh in this example as for this tutorial I did not need to. Using array modifiers, you can easily start developing walls and other columns in your project. This is just an example of what you can do with this workflow and how easy it can be to create all sorts of static environments. Hope you guys really enjoyed this tutorial and found it quite useful. There are many improvements to be made here for sure. One of the most important factors is to calculate your budget from the start, as the poly count can easily become a massive issue down the line. One solution would be to remesh the displaced geometry and clean it up and then retexture it in Substance Painter after unwrapping. Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed the content. If you would like to be notified the next time I post a new video, please press the bell icon below. Have a nice day, everyone!